Tommy's sixth grade science teacher, and for the first time in Tommy's life, Tommy was having a good time in a school subject. You see, Mr. Johnson was one of those teachers. He was real interactive, real engaging, had a charisma about him. He was a young guy, had a master's degree in biology, drove a red convertible sports car, and he was just one of those kinds of teachers that you just felt like, hey, this guy knows what he's talking about. He would take the kids on nature walks, and every now and then Tommy would hear something that kind of went against what he had been taught at home. He'd hear Mr. Johnson say something like, "Class, isn't it amazing how this bug evolved the ability to fly?" Or, "Class, isn't it amazing how this plant evolved the ability to protect itself from bugs that attack it?" Every now and then he'd hear something like that, but you know what? It never really dawned on him. Never really sunk into what was happening. He was just interested in the bug or the plant or whatever. Today was different. Today, Mr. Johnson stood in front of the class and he said, "Class, today we're going to learn how the universe got here. Can anyone tell me how that happened?" Eugene Lepton, he sat right here on the front row, read a science book for fun, made 100 on every science test unless there was a bonus question, 105 in that case. He said, "Yes, Eugene, can you tell me how that happened?" Eugene went into the standard textbook spiel. About 13.82 billion years ago, a tiny singularity exploded in what is commonly referred to as the Big Bang. Went through all of it. Mr. Johnson said, "That's exactly right, Eugene, thank you." And he was about to proceed with his class, and you see, out of the 30 kids in that class, about 26 of them knew that's not a thing that they had been taught at home. And so they were encouraged when Stephen raised his hand in the back. Mr. Johnson called on Stephen and said, "Yes, Stephen, do you have a question?" Stephen said in a brave but shaky, kind of nervous voice, he said, that's not right." And Mr. Johnson said, "What's not right?" And Stephen said, "That idea about the world coming from a big explosion, that's not right." Mr. Johnson said, well, what is right?" Stephen, whose dad was the preacher down the road, said, "Well, my dad says that God created the world. He spoke it into existence in 6 days." Now, that's what most of the class had been taught. Like I said, probably 26 or so of them, and they were very curious to see what Mr. Johnson would do with this piece of information, so they turned to look, and they were very surprised when a smile crept over Mr. Johnson's face, and he said, "Stephen, thank you. I was hoping someone would bring that up. Where did your dad get that idea?" And Stephen said, "From the Bible." And they were even more surprised when Mr. Johnson went to the top left drawer of his desk and he opened it up and he pulled out a black leather-bound book and he said, "Did it look anything like this?" It did. So Mr. Johnson opened the Bible and he started reading the first few chapters of Genesis, and he heard some words, the class did, as he read them. That's it: maketh, doeth, shalt, thou, thy. And as he continued to read, he stopped and he said, "Class, does this book sound old?" And for whatever else it sounded, it did sound old, and they had to admit that. And he said, "It is. It's a very old book." And in fact, he said, "Some people say it's almost 3,000 years old. That's argued, but some people say it is. And this book has some really good things in it," Mr. Johnson said. In fact, he said this book talks about a man named Jesus Christ who gave us something called the Golden Rule: do unto others as you have them do unto you. So that's a great rule for interacting with people. But he said, old books have old ideas in them, and modern science has disproven many of the ideas in this book. In fact, the science in this book has been disproven for years, and let me show you what I mean by that. And he turned to a passage that talked about the four corners of the earth. And he said, the people who wrote this book thought the earth was flat and square, and we know that's not right, don't we? As he put his hand on the globe there. And he closed that Bible and he put it back in the desk drawer and he went on with his lesson. And he left 30 sixth graders wondering what in the world they were going to do with their belief as to how the universe got here. Do you think that happens on a fairly regular basis? In one sense, that's a fictional story. In one sense, it's illustration. There's no Mr. Johnson, there's no Tommy, there's no Stephen, in one sense. In another sense, in the course of my traveling across the country, really across the world, I could repeat that for you in one shape, form, or fashion scores of times, and I would suggest to you that it happens on a regular basis, probably hundreds of times a day across our country. We are living right now in a time that is the most filled with unbelief that has ever been in the history of the United States of America. And I'm going to give you some stats as to how this plays out in the average man on the street's life. If you were to look from 2016, what you would find is that 25% of Americans identify themselves as having no religion whatsoever. So you go up to a person, 1 out of 4 people in the United States, if you ask them, what religion are you associated with? Are you a Christian? No. Are you a Muslim? No. Are you a Buddhist? No. Do you believe in any type of religious system? No. That's 1 out of 4, 25%. Now, you break that down into age demographic and you go to the 18 through 29-year-olds. And what you find is that 39% of 18 through 29-year-olds have no religion. So 1 out of 4 of everybody, about 1 out of 2.5 of the 18 through 29-year-olds say we're not affiliated with any religion whatsoever. We're not Christians, we're not Buddhists, we're not Hindus, we're not Islam, we're nothing. Now then, you look at that next stat, 64% of the nuns were raised religious and left. Now let me explain to you what's happening in the Lord's church and what's happening in the broader term Christianity as it's defined by most people. Right now, if you were to walk into any denominational church, any group that calls themselves Christians, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, etc., what you would find is that they are losing 60% of all of the young people that go through their congregations. So if you had 10 young people in the local Baptist, Presbyterian, Methodist, etc. congregation, if you had 10 right now, in 10 years, 6 of those would be gone. They would no longer be in those congregations or those religions. 6 out of 10. Now the Lord's church, the churches of Christ, are doing a little bit better than that. We're losing 4 out of 10. We're losing 40% of our young people. That's a stat. When you throw those stats out, it's a little troubling until you start thinking about that in a personal way. You know, let's take 10 young people and let's put them all up here on this front pew and let's ask which 4 of those you don't mind losing in the next 10 years. Whose son is that? Whose daughter, whose granddaughter, whose grandson, whose niece, whose nephew, whose friend? You see, that gets real troubling when we start thinking that out of every 10 of our young people, 4 of them are leaving when they get into their 20s. Now, as we start to ask ourselves the question, why is that the case? Several months ago, I was invited to speak at the Grant Street Church of Christ in Decatur, Alabama, and they asked me to do lessons on family. And what I thought I was going to do is stand up and do what I would call general Bible lessons on parenting and raising kids. Thought I'd go to Deuteronomy chapter 6, and we'd learn that, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and you shall teach these commandments to your children when you walk in the way, when you rise up, when you lie down. They shall be as frontlets on your eyes. You'll teach them and make sure your example shows them in practice. You know, I thought it was going to be general Bible. In fact, had no thought to doing any type of apologetic Christian evidence lesson at all. Thought I was just going to be doing some parenting ideas. And you know when the best time to write your book on parenting is? But me and my wife were going to write one. I mean, we had it, everything, we knew everything. When my brother had kids and we watched how he was raising them, we thought, we know, until we had a kid. Then we decided, no, we should have written our book before we had a kid, and that would have been the time to write a book on parenting, because that's when you know everything about it. Well, anyway, I was going to give them some biblical suggestions on parenting, and I didn't think it was going to have anything to do with Christian emphasis until I started researching why young people are leaving religions and why young people are leaving the Lord's church. Now, I want you to look at this stat right here. 64% of all the nuns were raised religious. So let's say we have in this room 100 18 through 29-year-olds. We've got 100 of them. And 64 of them, 64 out of that 100, who say, I'm not affiliated with any religion whatsoever, we ask them, how were you raised? Were you raised in an unbelieving home? Were you raised in a skeptical home? Were you raised in an atheistic home? 64 out of that 100 say, no. We were raised in a religious home, and many times, most times, that is, we were raised in something called a Christian home. But we left that. So you're losing 64%. That 64%, out of that 100, they were raised religious. but they left their religion. Okay, so why did they leave? As a part of New Survey, we asked these people to explain in their own words why they no longer identify with the religious group. So we got that 64 out of 100, and we said, okay, you left your religion, and you're no longer religious at all. Now notice, about half of the current religious nuns, about half of those 64, say we left because we don't believe anymore. Don't believe what? Well, as you continue to look at their answers, this includes many respondents who mention science as the reason they don't believe in religious teachings. And so they got them to say, what do you mean you don't believe? Could you explain that to us a little bit more? Could you be a little more specific? You don't believe in what? And here's what they said. Well, because I grew up and realized it was a story like Santa or the Easter Bunny. I realized that religion is in complete contradiction with the rational and scientific world. To continue to subscribe to a religion would be hypocritical. It no longer fits what I understand of the universe. Okay, these are the statements from the half. You got the 64 that say we just left religion. Half of them say we left because we don't believe. You then ask that half, 32 of them or so, and you say, why did you say that? What don't you believe in? Well, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in any religious idea. I believe in science. Now, if you had been here for this weekend, you understand that this statement right here, I realize that religion is in complete contradiction with the rational and scientific world. That is patently false. We have proven that. In fact, throughout the course of this weekend, we have shown that one idea actually does fit with all of the scientific information. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And one idea does not. There is no God, and the world is a blind, random product of chance processes over multiplied billions of years. That's not a scientific idea. We've shown that. But they're sitting in classes on a regular basis with people who they think are very intelligent, who have answers to many other questions that they have, and these people are teaching them that the belief in God is irrational, illogical, and unscientific. Now that's false. Couldn't be further from the truth. But that's what they're teaching them. And they are accepting and adopting that belief, and then when they get out of their religion and someone says, why'd you leave? They say, well, just because creation isn't scientific. Because that there's a God flies in the face of everything I know about the physical universe. No, it doesn't. It flies in the face of what you were taught in a secular institution that they weren't giving you the whole story, which we looked at yesterday. Continue with me. Learning about evolution when I went away to college, lack of any sort of scientific or specific evidence of the Creator. That is false as false could be. There's all kinds of evidence. We talked about it. But these kids aren't getting it. And so because they're not getting it, they're going away to college and they haven't been prepared to handle and deal with what they are taught by their professors, and they become unbelievers. I just realized somewhere along the line that I didn't really believe it. Now, it's hard to put all of these numbers together and see what the picture is, but here's what it looks like to me. That half of the young people who are leaving their religions are leaving because they say they don't believe anymore, and one of the main things they don't believe are the core beliefs of Christianity. There's three of them. There is a God. The Bible is God's Word. Jesus Christ is God's Son. If that is true of Christianity at large in the broadest sense, then when you come to the Lord's church and we're losing 40% of our young people, that means up to 2 of those 4, up to 20 out of every 100 are leaving the Lord's church because they don't believe in God, they don't believe in the Bible, they don't believe that Jesus Christ is God's Son. Now that was very troubling to me. But as I start to look back at how I'm approached lots of times at congregations like this, I'll go to a congregation, I'll deliver a lesson, and I'll have 1 or 2, sometimes 3 people come up and say, my son sat right in this pew. We took him to every youth event that there was. We taught him everything that we could, and he is now an atheist. My daughter, who now lives in California, now lives in some other state with some other person. We raised her to be a Christian, and she is no longer a believer at all. This happens, and you can see it happen on a regular basis, and it's very, very sad. And so what I realized was one of the major things that we've got to do as the Lord's church is prepare our young people to deal with the challenges that are going to come their way from the skeptical, unbelieving community. Now, it's exciting to me that your congregation, your elders, are seeing the need for that and are making sure that's being done here. That's what we've been doing all weekend this weekend. And I'm going to show you why that's so very important. Barry, and in my opinion, this is about as sad of a statement as you'll ever read. This man has been an atheist for decades. And here's what he said. When I was a young person in the 40s, being atheist was work. There were almost no books on the topic, no magazine articles, no columns in the newspaper. Everyone was assumed to be some sort of theist. Today, the books of Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris are readily available to any young person questioning the religion he or she was born into. The internet offers a plethora of information about both theism and atheism. It's much easier to figure out if atheism is a good fit. Add to that the fact that young people are openly questioning their religion of birth and that religions don't have good answers to skeptics. It's a wonder more young people haven't come over. He said, look, when I was growing up, you couldn't even get atheistic material. There weren't magazine articles on it. There weren't videos on it. You couldn't go to YouTube and find a video that gave you all the latest thinking from the atheistic community. I mean, you had to work to be an atheist. And basically he's saying, and I did the work to be an atheist. He said, now it's so easy to be one because our young people can access the latest atheistic thinkers and all of their information at the tip of their fingers. He said, and add to that the fact that when our young people are asking their parents and their elders and their deacons and their preachers questions about their religion, and those preachers, pastors, elders, deacons, etc., don't have good answers. They ask them about dinosaurs and they say they never existed. They ask them about the problem of evil, they say don't worry about it. They ask them about the existence of God, they say you shouldn't mess with that, it's something that everybody should know. You see the problem there. And he says it's a wonder more young people don't come over. Daniel Dennett said concerning anybody who teaches their kids something other than atheistic evolution, sends them to a public school system, he says here's what we're going to do. We're going, those of us who have the freedom of speech, we're going to feel free to describe your teachings as the spreading of falsehoods, and we're going to attempt to demonstrate this to your kid at our earliest opportunity. And folks, they do. At their earliest opportunity. You're talking first and second grade. As you continue to look at this, here's what Dan Barker said. He said, something important, significant is happening. In the United States, the number of campus secular clubs is growing rapidly. He said, I remember 15 to 20 years ago counting about half a dozen organizations who were unbelieving student-led organizations on campuses. Now, half a dozen. How many is that? 6. He said 20 years ago, now this book is a little bit older, 25, 30 years ago. He said you could go on a college campus and there might have been 6 around the country that had an organization that was an atheistic, skeptical, unbelieving organization. That's it, 6. He says, however, but today there are hundreds. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has been working with the Secular Student Alliance in a joint outreach project to college campuses, and the SSA is very busy just trying to keep up with the increase in affiliates. That's encouraging. Now think about that. In 30 years, you have gone from 6 skeptical, student-led organizations on campuses across the country, 30 years, to, if it was 6,000, I'd be surprised. It's probably upwards of 10. Virtually every single state-sponsored university in our nation has 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 skeptical organizations. The debate that I had with Dan Barker in 2009 was put on by a group called the Pastafarians, which is an unbelieving skeptical organization. They were doing that in a Darwin Day celebration. Not only do these colleges have organizations that are skeptical, that are unbelieving, that are atheistic, agnostic, but they have a sanctioned Darwin Day celebration on virtually every single campus every February. And this has all happened in the last 20 years or so. And as you start to look at that, you realize, hold on just a second. I'm going to have to make sure my young people are prepared to deal with this, because if I don't, there could be serious repercussions. In fact, this is something that is nationwide. Now, KJ from Oklahoma, here's what she says. She says, this is so scary. I'm battling this with my 15, almost 16-year-old right now. I should have started earlier, but the things that affect me don't affect him, and vice versa. Dinosaurs were the beginning of our problems. I'm so afraid of losing him to the world. Now let me ask you a question. Now I'm 41 years old, grew up in the Lord's church. My parents, when they were married, they owned a car dealership, and this particular car dealership was doing real well in Portland, but they decided that they needed to go to preaching school. So they sold it, went to Bear Valley School of Preaching, and from that time, my dad has preached for my whole life. Every year that I have been alive, my dad's been preaching. Grew up in the Lord's church. If you were to have said, Kyle, one of these days you're going to have a lot of people asking you about dinosaurs and how they fit into the Bible, because that's going to challenge some people's faith. Has it challenged yours? I would say, what? Has the subject of dinosaurs challenged my faith? No, never. Haven't even given it two thoughts. If someone were to say to you, Kyle, have you ever in your life been challenged to disbelieve in the existence of God? Has it ever been a faith problem for you? Have you ever run into anything that you just thought, oh no, that might not be the case, there might not be? Never. Never in my life have I ever thought for 1 second there is a chance there's not a God. It's never been something on my radar. I've known that there was a God from the time I was old enough to know anything, and I have never questioned that once. I've looked into the evidence. I have studied it closely and seen that the belief that I held from the time I was 2 years old is the truth. Just exactly like if someone told you 2 + 2 = 4 when you were 2 and you memorized that. And then when you start learning math and you start adding and you realize, okay, 2 + 2 is 4. I've believed it since I was 2 and now I see it to be true. That's been my life. It's never once been a challenge to my faith that the idea of, hey, there might not be a God, never once. And I dare say, many of you sitting in this audience today, it's never been a challenge to yours either. Some of you, you've grown up in the church. Some of you have been in the church longer than I've been alive. And if I were to say, have you ever questioned your belief in the existence of God? You would say no. But here's what happens. You don't question your belief in God. You deal with other subjects. There are other problems that you struggle with. Maybe it's how your mother can come down with a debilitating disease. Maybe it's what the Bible says here about. You deal with something challenges your faith, but not that. And so here's what you think. I never struggled with that. And so my young people shouldn't. They should just get it. Because it was never a problem for me. You know, that's how we are sometimes. We just kind of think everybody's like us. And if we didn't struggle with it, they shouldn't. And they should just get it. And I don't really need to give them an answer. Nobody had to give me an answer because I always just accepted it. So just get it. You know the problem with it. They don't just get it. You have to teach it to them. And let me explain to you what I mean. I'm a weed eater. I have been weed eating for years and years and years. In fact, I don't like to brag. I don't like to brag about stuff, but I am a great weed eater. I mean, exceptional. I mean, I'm one of the best weed eaters that I've ever seen. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Here's why I'm such a great weed eater. When I was growing up, we had a lawn care service, and this lawn care service was called Clean Cut Lawn Care. I had 2 older brothers. They were probably 16 and 15, and I was 13. And we bought a Craftsman 18 horsepower, what I would call belly mower. Had the blade underneath the belly, and it had about a 30-degree turning radius. And who gets to ride the lawn mower when you have a 16-year-old, 15-year-old, and 13-year-old in a mowing business? Yeah, maybe a better question might be, who doesn't get to drive the brand new 18 horsepower Craftsman riding mower? I did not. And so I started out with those little McCulloch weed eaters. They're a little bent shaft, crook shaft, yellow McCulloch weed eaters. But we would literally burn the heads off of those. We would mow so much grass that it would melt the metal part of it. So we had to move up to something a little bigger. As we progressed, there was a weed eater, probably the greatest weed eater I've ever seen. It's called a Shindawa. Now, when I first got a hold of a Shindawa weed eater, after I used those little McCullochs, you really, in order to operate a Shindawa, you probably need a helicopter's license, pilot license, because, I mean, the torque on the thing, if you hit a tree with it, I'm talking, 5, 6-year-old, I mean, it just plowed it down. It was the greatest weed eater I'd ever seen, and I thought, I was like, oh, yes. Okay, so I'm weed eating, have been weed eating for years and years and years, and I'm really, really good at it. Not only have I had lots of practical experience, but I went to a school where we had shop class, and the teacher had a class on how to weed eat. Now, some of you have weed eaten, right? You ever sat in a technical class on how to do it? Yeah, I mean, he told you exactly which direction you needed to go to make sure you didn't shoot stuff back at you, all the ins and outs of the... I was bragging about weed eating. You know, of course, this is tongue-in-cheek, but I said I could weed eat in a suit and not get a single blade of grass on me. So, the other day, we were showing our house there in Florence, Alabama, and we hadn't weed eated, and I was dressed about like this, and I needed to get it weeded real quick, and I didn't have really time to change, and my son Drew said, you know, Dad, you said you could weed eat in a suit and not get any on, why don't you go do that? So I said, all right, I'm going to give it a shot. So I did. Now, it takes about twice as long to weed eat in dress clothes if you're trying not to get grass on you, and here's what else I learned. I've had to qualify the statement. I can weed eat in a suit and not get any grass on me if the wind is blowing in the right direction. The wind is a factor. It is a factor in getting it on you. So after I got through weeding, I had like 2 tiny blades of grass on one of the folds near my shoe, and I thought, you know, that's pretty good. I mean, that is pretty good. I'm a good weed eater. My son's terrible. He's no good. In fact, he can't even weed eat. And I doubt he knows how to crank the weed eater. Now, the weed eater, to crank it, I don't know if you know how to crank the weed eater. I don't know if you know how to crank mine. Most of them are pretty standard. You got a little round rubber button on the top that you have to press to get the gas into the carburetor. Then you have to flip a little switch that gets the gas up to choke. And then on the handle, as you look down, there's another little button you have to press. It's got a little O or a little line on it. You got to press it down to the line, which means the gas is getting to the thing. And then you got to crank it 1 or 2 times. And when it cranks a little bit, then you flip the choke back down to full gas. And then if you run out of string, you hit the head of the weed eater on something hard, because that head is an automatic feed head and it sends string out. I don't know if you've ever weed eated. If you haven't, you wouldn't be any good at it. In fact, I don't know if you know how to start the weed eater. My son can't do it. Let me tell you what he can do. I had a yard. It was about 2.6 acres. We had to have a decent mower to mow it in any type of decent time, and so we got a 25 horsepower John Deere zero-turn lawnmower. Really neat, great mower. My son was out driving it. He came in and he said, "Dad, you can really drift on this mower." You know what drifting is? Okay, now listen. I grew up, if you wanted to make a turn on a riding lawnmower, you had to think about 3 minutes in advance as to how you were going to turn. If I wanted to come back around to where I was going that way, well, you had to go around, and it was a 30-degree, and then you finally got it to cut, then you could go down. There were no sharp corners in the mowing that I did. It was all very long and rounded. My son is driving a 6-mile-an-hour John Deere zero-turn, and he drifts on it, which means he hammers the brake and the gas at the right time so that the back end swings around and it flips to exactly where he wants it without even turning it. It just whipped it. And that's not even a word. I mean, I don't know what it does. Just now, it's not good for your grass, incidentally. When it slings around, it cuts a little bit of all the way down to the dirt grass, and I had to stop the drifting. But anyway, if you would have at 14 said, "Kyle, go take this zero-turn lawnmower and mow this person's yard." Do you know what would have happened if, when I was 14, someone had put me on a zero-turn lawnmower to mow someone's yard? If there was any landscaping, it would have been demolished. Any small tree, saplings of any sort, I would have run over them, and the blade probably would have been eaten up by all the rocks on the gravel driveway that I would have hit because I couldn't have controlled it. I didn't learn how to drive a 0-degree turn lawnmower until I was probably 28, 30 years old. My son does it better than I do now, and he's 14. But he can't crank a weed eater. After I used this illustration a time or two, he's like, "Dad, you got to teach me to crank a weed eater. I mean, you just got to. I need to weed eat." And I said, "No, you know what? No. I'm not going to let you learn to weed eat. You're going to have to learn it yourself because I want to keep using this illustration for a little while." And so he's asked me to learn to weed eat, and I've said, "No, you just keep driving your little zero-turn lawnmower, and I'll just keep weed eating, and we'll be fine." Here's the point. I weed eat, my son mows. He drives a zero-turn at 14. I didn't learn how to do that till 30. Now, if I'm going to put a weed eater in front of my son and say, just get it, well, with some trial and error, he might be able to, but he's going to have to look it up and figure it out. In 5 minutes, I could show him how to do it. But I would need to show him how to do it. Now, he can do stuff at 14 that I didn't learn till I was twice that age, because he's living at a time where that's readily available to him. It wasn't available to me. It is to him. You can't just say get it and expect them to because you did. You have to recognize the change in our society. And here's what that means. You're going to need to be able to sit them down and say, here's why we believe in God, and here's why that's scientifically accurate and correct, and here's why it meshes with everything we know to be scientific fact. And what you hear from other places, regardless of how smart the person is, that doesn't change the scientific facts that we know. But if you don't do that, and you send your kids out into the world, and you haven't sat down and taught them this kind of thing, well, let me show you exactly what the unbelieving world is trying to do. I think you know it. You don't need me to read Barker's statement to you. If we can divert just one young mind from going into the ministry or from wasting time and money on religion, we've made the world a better place, he says. Now that statement is as patently false and as demonic and ludicrous as any statement ever has been. He says if we could just keep one young person from believing in God, then we've done our job. You know what he knows about you? A lot of you. A lot of you sitting in here who are members of the church, you've been members of the church for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years. He knows you're not going to unbelieve in God now. But I'll tell you what else he knows. He knows that maybe, just maybe, you won't take it serious to make sure your young people have been taught to defend their belief in God. And all he's trying to do, and all the unbelieving community is trying to do, is get that one young person who's not prepared and say, hey, let us show you something different. Now let's change that around and let's ask this question. What if in this congregation we decided that our mission was going to be to make sure that just at least one young person, or even better, that not a single young person left our congregation without being able to defend a belief in God? Would that go miles and miles and miles in defeating this atheistic agenda? Absolutely, positively. Let me tell you what happened to me the other day. I was doing a seminar very much like this. I was standing up at the podium. I was getting ready to put my slides in and everything, and a young man came up to me. Looked like he was about 24. His wife, as I recall, was sitting about the third row. She had their child in her arms. There, I think it was a weekend seminar like this. Might have been a Friday or a Saturday. He came up to me, very, very intent on finding me and talking to me. He came and said, I just got to talk to you. I said, yeah, shook his hand. Looked me right in the eye. He said, I've got to thank you for something that you have done. You might not even know that you've done. I said, yeah, what you got? He said, I was a kid and I was 16, 17 years old. He said, I love science, I love biology, and I was getting into the science and biology of things, and I had several teachers who were unbelievers, and I started losing my faith. He said, and then I got in touch with Apologetics Press and the materials that you guys were producing, and he said, it literally saved my faith, and almost with tears in his eyes. He said, and I just want to thank you for putting that material out. Now, let me tell you what I'm not doing here. I'm not trying to brag about what we do at Apologetics Press. The Lord accomplishes anything good that gets accomplished through what we do. But think about this. What person in that congregation might have been responsible for directing him to those materials? What person in his life might have said, hey, I know you're studying this stuff. Would you take a look at this? What person in his life recognized the need to defend the truth and saw that in this young man there was a question about the existence of God and helped him find the answer? And what I'm challenging every one of us to do is be the person who is looking for opportunities to bolster our young people's faith and put them where they need to be in order to defend the foundational core beliefs of Christianity. When you go to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, the Bible explains to you that without faith it's impossible to please God. You got to have faith. And then verse 6 says, and you have to believe that God is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. You know, we've been talking this morning about the fact that God is. There is a God, and that's the fundamental core belief of Christianity, and it's the fundamental fact of the world. But the second aspect of that is that you have to believe that He rewards those who diligently seek Him. That God cares about you. He wants you in His fold. He wants you in His kingdom. He wants you to be a part of the spiritual family that He has designed through the blood of Jesus Christ. Are you? You know, when you bring somebody to the belief in God, you then take them to the next step and say, that Creator who made you, loves you so much that He came and He died in the flesh for you. We sang some very powerful songs, especially there before the Lord's Supper, about what our Savior has done for us. And He died on that cross for you so that you could be in His spiritual family and live eternally. And in order to have faith and be pleasing to God, you've got to recognize that God really cares about you, and He'll reward you when you diligently seek and obey Him. Have you obeyed Him? Have you become a New Testament Christian? Have you confessed your belief in Jesus Christ, believing it with all your heart? Repenting of your sins, being buried in water baptism for the forgiveness of those sins? Coming in contact with the blood of Jesus and being raised from that watery grave as a totally new creature. It's thrilling, isn't it? It's exciting to know that the God who created me wants to have a personal relationship spiritually with me so I can be in His spiritual family that He bought with the blood of His Son on the cross. Are you a Christian? If you're not, don't let another day go by until you make that right with your Creator. If we can help you respond to the Lord's invitation, please let us as we stand and as we sing.